everybody. This is Pastor Brady, and this is the 18th episode of the Menorah podcast ministry. And we are just so glad to be back on the air with you. May is getting ready to wrap up, May the 30th, and we want to get another podcast in, seeking to provide great Christian content on the Menorah podcast as we seek to share the light, send the light, and speak the light. And yet again, I am privileged and honored to be sitting here with Brother Al.
Hey guys, how are we doing today?
So Al, we're going to talk a little bit today. We've told our listeners several times that this is our Bi-Centennial year. And so we are in our 200th year as a church. We do the pastor profile once a month, and we're starting to do that twice a month when there's a month that has 5 Thursdays, simply because we want to make sure we get some of these pastors of the past on here. And so today we are going to be discussing Reverend John Kerr Munroe. Formerly known as J.K. Munroe by many. If you're wondering, as far as the other pastor profiles that we've done, you can find all of them archived on YouTube. All of those are found on there, but we've done Pastor R.G. Lee, we've done Adrian Rogers, and then we've also done Ernest Lloyd Teal, which was a former pastor here. And the last one that we did back on May the 2nd was Reverend Talbert. So we did Pastor Talbert and discussed him and got a lot of good feedback. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about John Kerr Munroe. So Alan, I want you to know that John Kerr Munroe served as pastor here from 1945 to 1954. So that is originally when he was here. But our church records also indicate that he came back on numerous occasions and preached revivals, preached special services, and also served as interim pastor between Richard Crapps and Bill Pauling.
I do remember some of those special sermons.
When I say the name John Kerr Munroe, what comes to mind? What do you remember?
He was such a humble, well-educated man. I can remember both he and his wife. I mean, I can still see both of them in my mind, and they are a quintessential ministry couple. Mm-hmm. You know, she was part of his ministry. What little I remember, I of course don't remember anything other than probably part of his interim and some of the special services
Well, you mentioned a little bit about his education. I do want to go ahead and say this, and this is no knock against anybody that has served as pastor here. But I do think if you look at his resume, which I'm going to go over, I definitely think he's probably the most educated pastor that has served here. I know Dr. Pauling is up there as far as education, but he got most of his education after he was at Gaston first. So just want to let you guys know that Reverend Munroe moved to the Columbia area in 1944 to become the Dean of Men, and he was a professor in church history at Columbia Bible College, which is now CIU. So that is what originally led them to the Midlands. He was born, to back it up a little bit, he was born in 1911 in Canada. And so all throughout his life, he had family in Canada, Indiana, California, and those are kind of the main places. So he brought his family to Columbia, but he mostly lived in these different places. And so he passed away in August of 2007, and he is buried in Columbia. He passed away in a retirement center in Clinton, Tennessee. So he was the oldest of 4 children that were born in Wharton, Ontario, Canada. And so I don't know this for a certain fact, but I feel confident in saying he's probably the only Canadian that has served as the pastor of First Baptist Gaston.
Yeah, I was not aware of that. I'm sure at some point I was told that years ago, but I just, it's just one of those things that I didn't remember. I would have been pretty small when he was here.
Yeah, you would have been a young fella, but what's so interesting is a lot of those that are older. I did a funeral a few weeks ago for Helen Lockman. And every time I do a funeral for a senior saint, I look at our church records and I want to know when they were baptized. And most of those senior saints were baptized between 1945 and 1954, and they were baptized at Hallman Mac Pond. What Terry Pound has told me many times is that John Kerr Munroe was a part of that. They didn't have a baptistry in the church at that time. They would wait until they had a bunch of new converts, and then Reverend Munroe, they'd all go out for a baptism service. During his youth, he moved to Western Canada, and so he, very interesting, he was a farmer. He harvested grain as a youth. He drove a 4-horse team and wagon, and so a lot of farming out there in Western Canada. I've been to Western Canada before, in Alberta, on different mission trips that I've been out there, and love that area. What's interesting is that his first place of education was the Canadian Pentecostal Bible College in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And what I want to tell our listeners, what you might not understand, is that we haven't had a Southern Baptist seminary out there in Canada until the last 15 years. So he might have grown up Pentecostal, I don't know, but that's probably as limited as the education would have been at that time. And so he also completed undergraduate studies at Wheaton College in Illinois in 1935. What's interesting is that he would have been out there around the same time that Billy Graham was out there in that area. So very interesting there. He then went on to teach. Obviously, he had the gift for teaching. When you look at his resume, he taught at South Mountain Industrial School in North Carolina, and then he went on to attend Dallas Theological Seminary and earned that master's degree in theology in 1939. Then he pastored for 4 years in a church in Ohio. That was before he came to Columbia. And so he came to Columbia to join the faculty at Columbia Bible College. He later became the director of missions and then also taught pastoral care classes, English Bible classes. He also taught Greek classes on John and Romans, and as well as different graduate work in history at the University of South Carolina. So he taught at CIU and the University of South Carolina. So I definitely think, and I've heard this a lot, some guys, when guys start pastoring, they realize very early on, hey, I need to be teaching. I need to be in a classroom. That's more my thing or whatever. And so he realized that, but was still able to stay in the pulpit. So he retired from teaching and administration in 1967. So that means he retired when he was 66. But he continued to do different kind of work and things. He was full-time at Columbia Bible College, and then also he served here at Sandy Run, which is now First Baptist Church of Gaston. And so what's really significant about Reverend Munroe's ministry is that he was a part of changing the course for our church at that time. What most of our listeners don't know is prior to World War II, most churches in our area were on circuits. And so we were in a circuit with Swansea and Antioch. And so our church, prior to World War II, held services once a month. The entire time Edgar Davis was here, we were having services once a month, and he was also pastoring Antioch and Swansea First Baptist. And it's also interesting to note that Reverend Munroe started serving our church in one of the toughest times in our church's history. From 1943 to 1944, our church lost 5 boys that died while in combat in World War II, different areas of the war, but we lost several. And so he came right after that time. And so what's important to note is that Reverend Munroe led Sandy Run Baptist Church, which after he served and Reverend Talbert came, the name changed to First Baptist Gaston. But he transitioned the church from once a month services to weekly services. And so, on record, he is the first, quote-unquote, full-time pastor that the church ever had, meaning he lived in the parsonage and he preached every service.
Well, let me ask you this. Being a young fella that's taking college-level courses now, what do you think about his ability to teach that and to lead a congregation all at the same time?
Yeah, I would definitely say I'm taking a full load in seminary. I'm not teaching. But, if God were allow one day for me to do that, I would love to do that. I think it's very possible if you have good time management skills and if you have a staff. So what you got to understand about this time period is that they were transitioning from once a month. So I would go out on a limb and say that they were pretty self-sufficient. And what I mean by that is they weren't as dependent on the preacher for pastoral care at that time. Because think, the history of the church, they had been taking care of one another.
Right.
And so you're coming at a good time to be able to do that. I think the congregation would have just been happy that they get a sermon every Sunday. They didn't get that. And so you do get that change. And I think that, being the first to live in a parsonage was a new thing. It was an era of high cotton for the church, specifically for this church that was extremely rural at that time. Just recently have we transitioned from rural to suburban, so that's a recent transition for us. And so according to how our association categorizes us as a church, based on how many people live here and attend here and all that kind of stuff. And so as far as that transition for the church, and later on they would start having evening services and Wednesday services, and Munroe was a big part of that. But what I think you also have to understand is that the church is just happy to have them in the community. And I don't think the pastoral care duties were as much as they morphed into as the decades went along.
Right.
So I think it was much more possible then than the way our culture has become. And our churches are transitioning back to the New Testament model of people taking care of people. Because according to Ephesians, the work of the pastors is to do the work of equipping the people in the church for the ministry, not to do all the ministry. And so we got away from that for about 50 to 60 years, and now you're starting to see churches return to that. I do think it's possible. But yeah, a long way of answering that question is that he came in a different era where I don't think as much was expected. And I do think with his level of education that the people understood, hey, he can bless us, but we can also make some sacrifices so that he can bless other people. And I think that's important that congregations remember that, yes, your pastor's your pastor, but he can also bless others.
Well, I think society at that time they were more about helping their neighbors. Everything was more community oriented.
Yes.
And so that was a natural extension, was the folk that you went to church with, oftentimes were the same folk that you went to school with. It was more people knew their neighbors and spent time with their neighbors. So they knew their neighbors' needs.
Yep.
They knew what would be important to their neighbors. So,
well, and I think you have to understand too, at that time the church was we got to remember it was much smaller than it is right now. And but it was smaller because there wasn't as a large pool of people. I'm looking here, and in 1948 the church averaged 118 people in Sunday school. And back then, see, this is something our listeners don't understand either. More people were inclined to go to Sunday school than they were to go to preaching, because most of your old timers at that time had been going to Sunday school their entire life every week, and service was only once a month.
Right.
So then to ask them to go to service every Sunday night, and every Wednesday, it's like, hold up. It goes from hearing 12 sermons a week or a year to like one every week. Big change. I've gotten that question before, and most of your people, there are still people today at different churches. Every church has them, different people that only go to Sunday school, and that's fine. That's your decision. But a lot of that stems from the old days where that's all that they had. But in my study in the history of churches, most of the time, if a church has 118 average attendance in Sunday school, and here's the thing to notice, that 233 people were registered in Sunday school, but only 118 were average attenders. And so that's interesting. That's back when you registered for Sunday school and you had like a number of registrations. See, we don't do that anymore. We just keep the average. So, we average 188, low 200s. Well, we probably have 400 people that are quote unquote registered, meaning they've come within the last year. But that's your average. So I would say for a church that has 118 people in Sunday school in 1948, I'd say in worship 90, 95. One thing to kind of answer that question you asked me a minute ago is I'm looking in the records here, and it does discuss about Reverend Sam Watts. So Samuel Watts being in the community. And so it doesn't say that he was on staff, but it does kind of give the inclination that he did help out. So I think that's really, really interesting. So any other thing you can think of about John Kerr Munroe after he left our church? Our church was the last one that he was the official pastor at. and then went on to live in Columbia for a while and served at different churches, was a member at North Trenton Baptist Church and different churches in the area, served as Sunday school teacher at other churches. So our church was kind of the last one that he pastored. It's very interesting to look at the impact that he still has today and how many people he was a part of baptizing here.
I think that if you look back over his life, the folks that he touched here in our community, as well as the folks he touched while he was out at Columbia International, would be a pretty big deal.
And I think it's also important to note that the 1940s, when Reverend Munroe came, that was the first time we've had Bible school. That's when Bible school came to our church.
Wow.
So Bible school was a very new thing back then. And so it kind of took a break during the Great Depression, and then it kind of made its way back after World War II.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it is interesting to note. In 1950, I just told you in 1948, the average Sunday school attendance was 118. It jumped up to 161 in 1950. So that's really cool to be able to see that. And I've got the records of all the association at that time, and so it's interesting to kind of see where First Baptist Gaston stacks up. So, all right, guys. Well, that's our pastor profile on Reverend J.K. Munroe, John Kerr Munroe. And hopefully you've enjoyed that. Hopefully you learned something today. We want to thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next week where it will be June already. All right, y'all have a good one. This is the Menorah podcast that seeks to share the light, spin the light, and speak the light of Christ Jesus to a dark and dying world through the internet waves of podcast ministry. Have a good one, guys.
See you next week.